For years, people have asked this question, as if it were a simple contest of strength versus speed. They imagine a bell ringing, two men stepping forward, and a winner decided by force alone. That framing is convenient, but it misses the truth entirely. Because what would really happen between Bruce Lee and Joe Frazier cannot be understood by fantasy, exaggeration, or loyalty to one discipline. It can only be understood by looking at who these men actually were, how they trained, how they thought, and what each brought into a moment of real confrontation. This is not about declaring a winner. This is about understanding reality. To understand what would really happen between these two men, you first have to step away from fantasy and slow the moment down. Joe Frazier and Bruce Lee were not built from the same blueprint, and they were not solving the same problems in their lives or training. They were shaped by entirely different environments, pressures, and goals, and those differences matter more than any imagined matchup ever could. Joe Frazier was forged inside pressure from the very beginning. Boxing did not allow hesitation or escape. Every round demanded forward movement, punishment absorbed, and punishment returned. He learned to live inside discomfort. His body became accustomed to impact, exhaustion, and chaos. Pain was not an interruption to his performance. It was part of it. Each fight reinforced the same lesson. Survival belonged to the man who could continue advancing when everything inside him wanted to stop. This is where Joe Frazier's confidence came from. It was not theoretical. It was earned through repetition under extreme conditions. He trusted his ability to endure because he had already done it countless times. When people talk about his power, they often focus on his punches, but his real weapon was psychological. He believed he could walk through whatever stood in front of him, and that belief shaped how he fought. Pressure was not something he feared. It was something he applied. Bruce Lee came from a completely different world. His training was not built around absorbing punishment, but around avoiding unnecessary damage entirely. He questioned why force needed to meet force when timing, positioning, and awareness could make brute strength irrelevant. Instead of preparing to endure chaos, he prepared to control it. His approach was analytical, stripped down, and deeply intentional. Bruce Lee studied movement the way others study language. Every motion had a purpose. Anything that did not serve efficiency was removed. He did not train to prove toughness. He trained to reduce uncertainty. His confidence did not come from knowing he could survive a storm, but from knowing he could avoid standing in its path to begin with. Where Joe Frazier trusted endurance, Bruce Lee trusted understanding. These two worlds rarely intersect cleanly. Boxing demands commitment to engagement. Once distance closes, there is no option to disengage completely. You exchange, you absorb, and you continue. Bruce Lee's philosophy questioned that entire premise. He believed commitment should be selective, not constant. Engagement should happen on his terms, not by default. This difference shapes how each man interprets danger. Joe Frazier saw danger as something to move through. Bruce Lee saw danger as something to manage, redirect, or deny. Neither approach is weak. Neither approach is superior by default. They are responses to different realities. Joe Frazier's environment rewarded forward pressure. Retreating meant losing ground, momentum, and psychological advantage. Bruce Lee's environment rewarded adaptability. Staying fixed meant becoming predictable. One man learned to overwhelm resistance. The other learned to dissolve it. This is why comparing them as opposites misses the point. They were not mirror images. They were specialists. Joe Frazier specialized in surviving and dominating inside chaos. Bruce Lee specialized in reducing chaos before it could fully form. Both approaches require discipline. Both require courage. Both demand a deep understanding of oneself. Their bodies reflected these philosophies. Frazier's physique was built for collision and endurance. Bruce Lee's was built for speed, balance, and control. Neither body type existed by accident. Each was a response to the demands placed upon it. The mistake people make is assuming that one world automatically defeats the other. Reality is more complicated. When systems collide, outcomes are not decided by reputation but by compatibility. A method that thrives in one environment may struggle in another. That does not make it inferior. It makes it specific. Joe Frazier did not need to think about angles or disengagement because his world did not reward them. Bruce Lee did not need to think about absorbing repeated heavy blows because his philosophy was designed to prevent that situation from occurring. Each man trained for the reality he expected to face. Understanding this removes the urge to declare a winner prematurely. Instead, it invites a deeper question: what happens when two truths meet? What happens when endurance confronts efficiency? When pressure meets precision? When chaos meets control? That question cannot be answered without respecting both worlds fully. Joe Frazier was not simply strong, he was psychologically relentless. Bruce Lee was not simply fast, he was strategically aware. Reducing either man to a single trait erases what made them exceptional. This first lesson is not about choosing sides. It is about recognizing that greatness can take different forms. Before imagining outcomes, you must understand foundations. And the foundations of these two men were built in entirely different worlds, for entirely different reasons. That difference is not a flaw in the question. It is the reason the question still matters. Most discussions about this matchup collapse before they even begin because people imagine both men operating exactly as they were seen on screen or in the ring. They picture Joe Frazier as the relentless heavyweight who never stops coming forward, and Bruce Lee as the lightning-fast martial artist striking with precision and speed. That image feels familiar, dramatic, and easy to argue about, but it ignores the most important truth of all. Real situations do not respect reputation, highlight reels, or comfort zones. Joe Frazier fought within a structure that rewarded pressure, endurance, and sustained engagement. Boxing rules shaped his instincts. He learned when to push, when to absorb, and how to keep advancing even when tired or hurt. That environment sharpened specific strengths, but it also narrowed the range of problems he was required to solve. His success depended on closing distance and staying there, trusting that his conditioning and will would eventually break resistance. Bruce Lee, on the other hand, never trained to remain inside prolonged exchanges by default. His philosophy was built around adaptability rather than endurance. He studied how people move under stress, how patterns form, and how predictability creates vulnerability. His training emphasized entering and exiting space, disrupting rhythm, and denying opponents the conditions they rely on. This approach worked because it avoided fixed scenarios and resisted being pulled into them. What most people ignore is that in a real encounter, neither man would be allowed to stay entirely inside his preferred world. Joe Frazier would not be facing a stationary target willing to exchange endlessly. Bruce Lee would not be facing a cooperative environment where distance and timing could be managed without consequence. Both would be forced to confront unfamiliar problems almost immediately. This is where imagination often fails. People assume adaptation is automatic, but adaptation is a skill that depends on experience. Joe Frazier's experience taught him to keep moving forward under pressure, but it did not require him to chase elusive movement or manage rapid changes in distance. Bruce Lee's experience taught him to control space and timing, but it did not involve absorbing the kind of sustained physical force that heavyweight boxing demands. The moment either man is pushed outside his usual conditions, assumptions begin to break down. Joe Frazier's pressure is most effective when it can be applied consistently. If that pressure is interrupted or redirected, it becomes harder to maintain. Bruce Lee's efficiency is most effective when distance and rhythm can be shaped. If space collapses repeatedly, efficiency becomes harder to preserve. Most people also ignore the role of decision-making under uncertainty. Boxing rewards commitment. Once you step in, you stay engaged. Bruce Lee's philosophy discouraged unnecessary commitment. He believed commitment should be chosen carefully, not imposed automatically. That difference matters, because real encounters punish premature decisions. Joe Frazier trusted his ability to impose his will through persistence. Bruce Lee trusted his ability to deny others the opportunity to impose theirs. Neither approach guarantees success when conditions change. Each requires adjustment, and adjustment under pressure is where outcomes are decided. Another overlooked factor is how habits become liabilities outside their intended context. Joe Frazier's instinct to move forward relentlessly was an advantage in the ring, but in a different environment, it could become predictable. Bruce Lee's instinct to disengage and reposition was an advantage in flexible encounters, but under sustained pressure, it could become exhausting. Habits are powerful, but they are also revealing. People often talk about strength and speed as if they exist independently of context. In reality, they are shaped by conditions. Strength matters most when contact is constant. Speed matters most when space exists. Remove either condition and the advantage shifts. This is why imagining a single fixed outcome misses the reality of how encounters unfold. What most people also ignore is that both men were intelligent. Neither would blindly repeat what stopped working. Joe Frazier was not incapable of adjusting, and Bruce Lee was not incapable of enduring discomfort. But adjustment takes time, and time is a luxury real encounters rarely offer. Early moments matter more than late corrections. This is why there is no honest shortcut to answering the question. You cannot declare a winner by listing traits. You must consider what happens when those traits are tested in unfamiliar ways. What breaks first is not always strength or speed but certainty. The real mistake people make is assuming familiarity equals effectiveness. Just because a man mastered one environment does not mean he automatically controls another. Joe Frazier mastered the storm by walking through it. Bruce Lee mastered uncertainty by avoiding being caught inside it. When those philosophies collide, the outcome depends on who adapts first, not who looks better on paper. Ignoring this complexity turns the discussion into mythology. Acknowledging it turns the discussion into reality. And reality is rarely clean, decisive, or dramatic in the way people want it to be. That is what most people ignore. They look for a simple answer in a situation that was never simple to begin with. Distance is the factor most people overlook because it is invisible until it disappears. It does not announce itself the way power or speed does, yet it quietly determines which abilities can even be used. Joe Frazier and Bruce Lee understood distance in completely different ways because their worlds demanded different answers from it. What would really happen between them would depend less on who they were and more on where they were in relation to each other at every moment. Joe Frazier's effectiveness increased as distance closed. His power, balance, and rhythm were built for close-range engagement where pressure could be applied continuously. Each step forward served a purpose. He did not chase recklessly. He compressed space until opponents were forced to react inside it. Once there, his hooks and body shots became devastating not just physically, but psychologically. Distance collapsing meant momentum building, and momentum was where he thrived. Bruce Lee viewed distance as protection, opportunity, and control all at once. He trained to create space, break space, and leave space again before opponents could stabilize. Distance was not something to erase permanently, but something to manage dynamically. His footwork was designed to prevent opponents from setting their weight, aligning their power, or predicting his timing. Staying present too long was never the goal. Staying unpredictable was. This is where misunderstanding often begins. People imagine Bruce Lee dancing endlessly at range, landing strikes without consequence. That fantasy ignores the reality that space is contested. Joe Frazier would not politely remain at a distance that favored someone else. He would move forward relentlessly, cutting angles, forcing engagement, and absorbing contact to reduce separation. His entire approach was built around denying opponents the luxury of space. At the same time, people underestimate how much effort it takes to maintain distance against sustained pressure. Constant movement is physically demanding. Each retreat requires balance, awareness, and timing. Bruce Lee's efficiency reduced wasted motion, but efficiency does not eliminate fatigue entirely. Maintaining space against a determined forward-moving force is not effortless. It requires precision every second. This is why distance would not remain static. It would fluctuate constantly. There would be moments where Bruce Lee controlled space, disrupting rhythm and denying stability. There would also be moments where Joe Frazier closed the gap through persistence and pressure. Neither outcome would be permanent. Control would shift back and forth depending on timing, terrain, and decision-making. Distance also affects perception. When space is wide, speed feels dominant. When space is tight, strength feels dominant. Bruce Lee's speed mattered most when he could enter and exit cleanly. Joe Frazier's power mattered most when opponents were forced to stay. Each man's advantage depended on maintaining the distance that favored him while denying the other the same privilege. Another overlooked aspect is how distance influences commitment. Closing space requires commitment forward. Maintaining space requires commitment to movement. Both commitments carry risk. Joe Frazier risked exposure while advancing. Bruce Lee risked exhaustion while repositioning. Neither approach was free of consequence. What people often forget is that distance is not just physical but psychological. When Joe Frazier closed in, he imposed presence. When Bruce Lee created space, he imposed uncertainty. Pressure compresses decision time. Space expands it. Both can overwhelm if applied correctly. This is why the idea of a single decisive moment is misleading. Distance would be negotiated continuously. One misstep could allow pressure to overwhelm precision. One miscalculation could allow speed to disrupt momentum. The margin for error would be thin on both sides. Distance would also influence adaptability. Joe Frazier was accustomed to fighting through discomfort at close range. Bruce Lee was accustomed to adjusting rapidly to changing space. Each would be pushed toward unfamiliar limits. The question would not be who preferred which distance, but who could impose their preference more consistently. This constant battle over space explains why predictions fail. People focus on outcomes instead of process. They imagine strength winning or speed winning, without understanding that neither exists independently of distance. Distance is the gatekeeper. It decides which tools can be used and which become irrelevant. In the end, distance would not belong permanently to either man. It would be contested, lost, regained, and contested again. Control would shift moment by moment, not because one philosophy was superior, but because reality resists permanence. That is why distance would decide everything. Not in one dramatic instant, but through a series of small victories and losses that accumulate until one side gains enough control to matter. People often talk about pressure as if it were a single force, but pressure comes in different forms, and each form tests a different part of a person. Joe Frazier and Bruce Lee were both masters under pressure, but they were masters of different kinds. Understanding this difference is essential to understanding what would really happen if their worlds ever crossed. Joe Frazier's relationship with pressure was physical and relentless. He was conditioned to endure pain, fatigue, and impact without retreating mentally. Heavy blows did not disrupt his focus. They reinforced it. He learned to remain functional while uncomfortable, to keep moving forward even when his body demanded rest. This ability is rare and powerful. Many fighters lose clarity once pain accumulates. Frazier did not. His mind stayed intact while his body absorbed punishment, and that combination made him dangerous. Physical pressure compresses time. It forces immediate response. When fists are coming toward you, hesitation is punished. Joe Frazier thrived in this environment because his decision-making was simplified by commitment. He did not overthink. He trusted his conditioning and his will. That trust allowed him to operate inside chaos without freezing. Bruce Lee applied pressure in a different way. Instead of overwhelming the body, he unsettled the mind. He disrupted patterns, refused predictability, and denied opponents the emotional clarity they relied on. His movements were designed to create uncertainty rather than exhaustion. By changing rhythm, distance, and timing, unexpectedly he forced others to think while acting, which is one of the hardest things to do under stress. Mental pressure expands time in the worst way. It introduces doubt. When someone is unsure of what will happen next, reactions slow, choices fragment, and confidence erodes. Bruce Lee understood this well. He knew that when predictability disappears, even strong and conditioned opponents hesitate. That hesitation creates openings that do not exist in purely physical exchanges. This difference matters, because physical and mental pressure do not cancel each other out. They interact. A person enduring physical pressure may still function well if their mental state remains clear. A person experiencing mental pressure may collapse even without severe physical damage. Which form dominates depends on timing and circumstance. Joe Frazier's advantage lay in his ability to continue functioning despite pain. Bruce Lee's advantage lay in his ability to introduce confusion without absorbing punishment. If physical pressure arrived early and consistently, it could overwhelm the space Bruce Lee needed to operate. If mental pressure arrived early and effectively, it could disrupt the rhythm Joe Frazier relied on to apply force. Another overlooked element is how each man recovered under pressure. Joe Frazier recovered through momentum. The more he engaged, the more settled he became. Bruce Lee recovered through adjustment. The more information he gathered, the clearer his responses became. Both methods work, but they work best in different environments. Mental pressure also affects ego. When people are unsure, they often overcompensate. They rush decisions or force actions that are not necessary. Bruce Lee used this tendency against others by refusing to meet expectations. Joe Frazier, on the other hand, thrived when opponents reacted emotionally to his advance. He did not need them to doubt, he needed them to stand still long enough to be hit. This interaction creates a complex dynamic. Mental pressure seeks to create hesitation. Physical pressure seeks to eliminate it. The outcome would depend on which pressure established itself first and how the other responded. There is no automatic victory here, only shifting advantage. It is also important to recognize that both men respected pressure, neither avoided it entirely. Joe Frazier accepted pain as part of the process. Bruce Lee accepted uncertainty as part of growth. Their courage expressed itself differently, but it was present in both. Most people reduce pressure to toughness, but toughness takes many forms. Enduring pain is one form. Remaining clear while uncertain is another. Joe Frazier mastered the first. Bruce Lee mastered the second. Comparing them without acknowledging this difference leads to shallow conclusions. In a real situation, pressure would not remain one-dimensional. Physical and mental stress would rise and fall together, interacting unpredictably. Moments of clarity would be followed by moments of confusion. Strength would meet hesitation. Precision would meet persistence. The encounter would be decided not by who handled pressure better in theory, but by who imposed their type of pressure more consistently in practice. That is why mental pressure cannot be dismissed as secondary, and physical pressure cannot be dismissed as primitive. Both shape outcomes, both test limits, and both were areas where these two men excelled in very different ways. Understanding this brings the discussion closer to reality. It moves the question away from fantasy and toward respect for what each man truly represented. Pressure is not one thing, and mastery is not singular. Joe Frazier and Bruce Lee stood on different sides of that truth, each formidable in his own way. The reason this question refuses to settle into a clean conclusion is because real encounters are not decided by labels, loyalties, or imagined advantages. They are decided by moments, and moments are shaped by conditions that cannot be perfectly predicted. Joe Frazier and Bruce Lee each represented a complete system, not a single attribute, and systems do not collide neatly. They interact, adjust, and change each other in ways that resist certainty. People often want a simple answer because simplicity feels satisfying. It allows the mind to rest. But simplicity is rarely honest when dealing with complex human capability. Joe Frazier was not just strength and endurance, and Bruce Lee was not just speed and precision. Each man carried habits, instincts, and decision-making frameworks built through years of specific experience. Those frameworks would not disappear in a real encounter, but neither would they function perfectly outside their native environment. What complicates the answer further is that early moments matter more than later ones. Initial assumptions, first movements, and early adjustments shape everything that follows. A small miscalculation at the beginning can alter the entire trajectory of an encounter. This is why hypothetical outcomes collapse under scrutiny. They assume stable conditions, but reality shifts quickly. Joe Frazier's refusal to retreat was a powerful advantage, but it also committed him to constant engagement. Commitment simplifies decision-making, but it reduces flexibility. Bruce Lee's refusal to commit unnecessarily preserved flexibility, but it required continuous awareness and energy. Each approach carries risk. Which risk becomes decisive depends on timing rather than philosophy. Another reason there is no simple answer is because both men were capable of learning in real time. Joe Frazier was not a static force. He adjusted rhythm, angle, and pressure based on feedback. Bruce Lee was not a fragile strategist. He understood physicality and respected danger. Neither would blindly repeat a failing approach. Adaptation would occur, but adaptation under pressure is imperfect. People also underestimate the role of environment. Space, surface, lighting, and constraints influence movement and decision-making. A confined area favors pressure. Open space favors mobility. Uneven ground favors balance and awareness. Controlled environments favor predictability. Change any variable and advantage shifts. There is no universal answer because there is no universal setting. Fatigue further complicates the picture. Endurance is not just physical, but cognitive. Maintaining awareness, managing distance, and making accurate decisions drain mental energy. So does absorbing pressure and continuing to advance. As fatigue accumulates, preferences change, strategies narrow. Risk tolerance shifts. The man who looks dominant early may struggle later, or vice versa. Another overlooked factor is expectation. Joe Frazier was accustomed to opponents reacting to his pressure. Bruce Lee was accustomed to opponents reacting to his unpredictability. When those expectations are not met, confusion arises. Confusion slows decision-making. Slowed decision-making changes outcomes. This feedback loop is difficult to predict because it depends on how quickly each man recalibrates. The idea of a definitive winner also ignores the possibility of partial outcomes. Control can exist without conclusion. Advantage can shift without resolution. Real encounters often end not with a clear victory, but with separation, interruption, or mutual recognition of risk. These outcomes do not satisfy arguments, but they reflect reality more accurately. People want mythology because mythology provides certainty. Reality offers probability. Joe Frazier increased his probability through pressure and endurance. Bruce Lee increased his probability through awareness and adaptability. Probability is not destiny. It is influence. And influence can be disrupted. This is why debates become endless. Each side selects the conditions that favor its preferred outcome and ignores the rest. But honest analysis requires acknowledging all conditions, even the inconvenient ones. When you do that, certainty dissolves. There is also respect embedded in uncertainty. To admit there is no simple answer is to admit that both men were formidable in ways that resist reduction. It honors the depth of their mastery rather than flattening it into comparison. The real mistake is treating complexity as weakness. Complexity is strength. It reflects reality. The world does not reward clean narratives. It rewards those who can operate within uncertainty. Both Joe Frazier and Bruce Lee built their lives around doing exactly that in very different ways. So there is no simple answer, because simplicity would require ignoring too much. Ignoring environment, timing, adaptation, fatigue, expectation, and human variability would produce a clean conclusion, but it would be false. The honest answer is harder to accept, but more accurate. Outcomes would be shaped moment by moment, influenced by conditions, and decided by adjustment rather than mythology. That does not make the question meaningless. It makes it real. What would really happen would not look like a movie scene, and it would not end in a clean, satisfying conclusion the way debates often demand. It would unfold slowly, through tension, adjustment, and uncertainty, with both men testing the limits of their understanding rather than rushing toward a decisive moment. The encounter would not begin with violence, but with reading, measuring, and probing, because both men respected danger too much to act blindly. In the opening moments, Joe Frazier would do what he had always done. He would apply presence. His forward movement would not be reckless, but intentional, designed to reduce space and impose pressure. Every step would communicate the same message he had delivered throughout his career. He was willing to move into discomfort without hesitation. That alone would shape the atmosphere, because pressure changes how people think before it ever changes what they do. Bruce Lee would not respond by meeting force with force. He would respond by denying stability. His movement would not be constant or frantic, but selective. He would shift angles, adjust spacing, and refuse to settle into a rhythm that could be exploited. His goal would not be to dominate early, but to understand how pressure was being applied and where it could be disrupted. He would be gathering information, not chasing a finish. As time passed, both men would be forced to adjust. Joe Frazier would realize that closing distance would not be simple or predictable. Pressure would need to be reapplied repeatedly, not just once. Each attempt would require effort, balance, and commitment. Bruce Lee would realize that maintaining space against relentless advance was physically demanding and mentally taxing. Efficiency would matter, but efficiency alone would not eliminate risk. Moments of advantage would appear and disappear. There would be brief instances where pressure narrowed options, and brief instances where movement dissolved momentum. Neither man would remain fully in control for long. Control would shift back and forth, not dramatically, but incrementally. Small successes would matter more than spectacular actions. Mental pressure would begin to accumulate. Joe Frazier would be testing whether unpredictability could be sustained. Bruce Lee would be testing whether persistence could be denied indefinitely. Both would be forced to confront unfamiliar problems, and neither would solve them perfectly. Adjustments would be made, some effective, some costly. Fatigue would play a role, not as exhaustion, but as narrowing focus. Choices would become simpler, reactions more instinctive. This is where philosophy meets reality. Joe Frazier's instincts favored engagement. Bruce Lee's instincts favored adjustment. Each instinct would help in some moments and hinder in others. What would really happen is that no single attribute would decide the encounter. Strength would matter, but only when contact occurred. Speed would matter, but only when space existed. Awareness would matter, but only if it could be maintained under pressure. Endurance would matter, but only if it did not lead to predictability. Every advantage would carry a condition. The encounter might end without a clear resolution. Separation could occur. Intervention could occur. Mutual recognition of risk could occur. These outcomes are often ignored because they do not satisfy debate, but they are common in reality. Not every confrontation ends with a definitive winner. Many end with understanding. And that is perhaps the most honest outcome. What would really happen is not the confirmation of one legend over another, but the exposure of how incomplete simple comparisons are. Joe Frazier and Bruce Lee would not invalidate each other. They would reveal each other's limits. The real lesson is not about who would win, but about why the question persists. It persists because both men represent different answers to the same human problem: how to survive pressure. One answered with endurance and forward motion. The other answered with awareness and adaptability. What would really happen is that reality would resist mythology. It would refuse to crown a single truth and instead demand respect for complexity. That may be unsatisfying to argument, but it is faithful to life. And in that sense, the question is less about combat and more about understanding that mastery can take different forms, and that greatness is not diminished by uncertainty, but revealed by it. The real value of this question was never about proving who would win. It was about understanding how different kinds of mastery collide when reality removes comfort and certainty. Joe Frazier and Bruce Lee were not symbols meant to cancel each other out. They were answers to different kinds of pressure, shaped by different paths, tested by different truths. What remains is not a verdict, but a reminder. Strength without awareness can be limited. Awareness without respect for force can be fragile. Reality lives in the space between those extremes, where adaptation matters more than reputation. And that is why this question still matters. Not because it can be solved, but because it forces us to look beyond legend and into the complexity that real mastery demands.